Gomes. I'm a public health researcher at FIOCRUZ in the scientific computing program there, processing. So my talk today, the idea is that I divide it in two parts. The first one, the idea is to talk about, go over a little bit examples of how far the community have managed to go into models for disease transmission. So we've seen in several of the talks already some nice examples of that. And the idea is to go over a little bit some of the details behind it and how we managed to incorporate more and more heterogeneities into those models and what we managed to accomplish with that. And then the second part, the idea is go into related kinds of close relative to this problem, but that has its own devils, which is the question of developing surveillance models, okay? And hopefully I'll be able to show you a little bit the difference between the two, okay? So, first of all, when I talk about epidemics and disease modeling, of course, immediate questions that come to mind is, well, how many cases should I expect once we have a new emergency, like a new pathogen is discovered or a new place is invaded by a given pathogen that was not present there. So we want to know how many cases we expect to observe in that population, right? What is the mortality rate associated to a given pathogen? But then there are also several and quite extensive list of other questions that are as important as those two and are actually related to those and necessary, and it's important to tackle those in order to actually assess the previous one. So here are a few examples of that. It's first of all, what makes a disease worse than others? Is it just mortality or actually the infectivity of different diseases? What is the role of agents' interactions? So communities that have a different social structure, different cultural approaches in terms of interaction between individuals, how that affect the spread of the same pathogen in different regions. Then does this pathogen, infection to this pathogen confer permanent, partial, or no immunity at all? Sociodemographics, mobility, and so on and so forth, okay? And as I just mentioned in the beginning, we have seen some nice examples of a few of those questions, right? So as an example for the first question, what make one disease worse than another, let's look quickly between SARS and influenza and the difference between those two. So both of them are respiratory diseases. They share pretty much the same mechanism of infection between individuals, right? So that both are transmitted by shared environment. They're airborne, direct contact with surface deposition. But then when you look into the number of cases of those two pathogens in different outbreaks or different epidemics, you see that during the SARS epidemic of 2002 up to 2003, we had about 8,000 cases worldwide, right? And it was a very important emergency in terms of public health. But then when you look into influenza, and you look into Brazilian data alone, last year, we had more than 5,900 positive cases for influenza among severe respiratory infections, illnesses, just in the public health system alone, okay? And when we look into 2016 season, which was a pretty intense one here in Brazil, we had almost 10,000 cases among that subset alone. And we are just talking about Brazil, okay? So, of course, SARS has a mortality rate that is way higher than influenza, but since it managed to infect a much smaller number of individuals, when you balance those two, you have different outcomes, okay? Because on the one hand, influenza is less lethal, but since it manages to infect a way higher number of individuals, the number of deaths in the end is higher, okay? So then again, which of those two is worse? Now, as I imagine most of you already know, one typical parameter that we use to try to assess this kind of put into perspective different diseases in terms of severity is the basic reproductive number, or not, which is basically the average number of secondary cases from a single infected one in a fully susceptible population. And we know that if this number is above 1, we expect to observe an outbreak. If it's lower, we expect just to fade out. But then, and this is a characteristic that is intrinsic to the disease itself, or it also depends on population characteristics. Now, if we look, for instance, into the data, this is the municipality of Rio de Janeiro, and this is the color of each health district within the municipality of Rio de Janeiro here represents a different estimate of R0 for Zika during the 2015 outbreak. And we see that there is a difference there, okay? And it's the same disease. It is the same epidemic, but different regions present different estimates for R0. Okay, so this is not, it's something that is very important, but we have to look carefully when we are looking into the details of that, okay? Now, as we know, we've seen already here several examples of compartimental models, and in this kind of review that I'm proposing here, we started, when I say we, I mean the community of modelers. We started with the classic Cameron-McKendrick model, simple model of an SIR, and during the last few years or decades, we managed to move forward on that and incorporating more and more compartments that are important for different diseases. And this is the key question here, okay? The number of compartments and the type of compartments that I must include in my model depends, of course, in the characteristics of the disease itself, okay? What is the natural evolution in the population? So for instance, we've seen examples of cases when it is important to separate the compartment of the infected individuals between asymptomatic, symptomatic, because they differ in their transmissibility. For certain diseases, it's also important to incorporate individuals that are at the hospital settings, because the transmissibility at that particular environment differs and is also important for the evolution. Also, we have examples that the body of the deceased patient is also a source of transmission. So we had that for Ebola, for example, and it was really important to the evolution of Ebola during the 2014 outbreak, for instance. And in fact, this model here is exactly, was used for modeling Ebola. So we can then have quite simple, let's say, differential equations for the model, but once we start adding up or piling up more and more compartments, more and more heterogeneities, we start to have a model that in the mathematical sense becomes more and more complex. And this morning, Lisa showed us a very nice example for malaria, which is quite complex, a quite complex model. And what is there because it needs to be there for that particular study, right? And we are always in kind of this push and shove between modelers and biologists in terms of, on the one hand, we want to have our model as simple as possible in the mathematical sense, but on the other hand, we cannot make it as simple that it no longer reflects the reality of that particular disease, okay? Now, once we started incorporating social demographic aspects like age distribution, household composition, educational infrastructure, workplace infrastructure, then we have another beast that comes into place, which is what we call the matrix, interaction matrix, which, for instance, in this example, age-dependent contact matrices, that what we have to do is, if you want to incorporate the different aspects of interaction in those different settings, we can go into census data, look into the distribution of households, age distribution within households, size of households, as Sarah mentioned yesterday. And then what we do is that we simulate, so we build a synthetic population where we have a representation of each of those households, respecting the age distribution and composition of those households. And then from that, we have for each household, what is the frequency of interaction between individuals of different age brackets. Okay, so for instance, in this household here, let's say we have 2 adults of 31 years old and 2 kids, 5 and 6 years of age, so that for the kids, they have 2/3 of their contacts within the households with individuals of 31 years of age, and only 1/3 with the other kid in the household, okay? And we can then combine all those households and then build what is the average contact frequency between different age brackets, okay? And we can do exactly the same exercise for educational facilities and workplaces. The same thing. We build each educational facility or each workplace respecting the size of those places, the age distribution, and so on and so forth. And then we can estimate the contact frequency. Yep?
So you have available information from the census or something about the workplace distribution?
Yeah. So it's on a different repository. So there is the educational census, and it's kind of, it went down a few months ago. I've checked, some of the links were broken down, so it's kind of tricky to get into that, and I'll go over that issue later on. But yeah, but the data is there. Get the data is another thing. Okay, but then, and then what we do is that now, once we have those matrices, what we can do is that the force of infection that used to be just beta times number of infectives divided by the population, now we have an age-dependent matrix of interaction. So our force of infection, the lambda I, can be written in terms of the entries of that particular matrix. And this population matrix is just the weighted average of the contact matrices of each of those settings. So household, workplace, education, and whole community, okay? So this is just an example of that type of exercise, taking provinces in Argentina, Mexico, and states in Brazil and USA. We went through census data of each of those countries, and we then built a synthetic population for each of those territories. And as also was mentioned previously here, of course, our model is only as good as the data that we plug into it, okay? So look, for instance, the data on age distribution in Mexico that comes from the census. It's an electrocardiogram, basically, right? We have all those spikes all over the place. There's something clearly wrong with that data, but that's the data. And of course, our model, once we use that data, we will have an age distribution that also have that same property, the same characteristics. So either we smooth it out and deal with it, or we say, well, this is the data. I'm going to do the best I can with exactly that data, and we can discuss later what are the limitations of that. It's a choice that you have to make, okay? And as long as you are clear which choice you made and what are the implications of that choice, should be fine, okay? So what comes out of it then is, as Sarah mentioned briefly, is that we see, once we then run simulations on each of those regions, we see that there is a nice correlation, inverse correlation between the attack rate, which is the final number of individuals that at some point got infected, and the average age of the population. So the younger the population, the higher the attack rate in general. And as Sarah pointed out, actually, once you take into account also the household size, you also have a pretty nice correlation, okay? And that the larger the household size, also the larger the attack rate in general, okay? So you can see that you have for different regions, it's the same as far as the disease is concerned, it's exactly the same. So it's exactly the same infectious rate, the beta. The recovery rate is also exactly the same for each state, but the outcome is completely different. And what is changing? Only the social demographic characteristic of the population. The disease is the same, but the outcome is completely different. Why? Because of the social structure. So taking into account social structure is important depending on what we want to do with our model, okay? And then if we choose exactly the same parameters to run our simulation at each of those provinces, we see that for the US, we have an attack rate that is way lower than what we have for the 3 Latin American countries here. Why? Because of the age distribution. The US have an age distribution that is more on par with developed countries, that you have an older population, in a way. And our 3 Latin American countries is a younger population, and as we've seen, the younger the population, the higher the attack rate. Okay? So, with this, I've closed a little bit this discussion on social demographic impact and move on into how can we incorporate mobility into our models. When we were discussing social demographic, I made the case, and I hope you believed my case, that the pathogen will circulate in the population by the way we interact at different settings of said population, but those settings might not need, they don't need to be at the same municipality. They don't need to be in the same neighborhood. So if we have individuals that live in a given city but work on a different one and they move back and forth every day, what they're doing is enabling a pathogen to move between those 2 municipalities. And if we manage to get our hands into mobility data in the population, then we can couple our epidemic model with this mobility data that we managed to get to build this structure like the patch model that was mentioned to try to identify how the pathogen might disperse in a larger territory. And of course, since we are living in a strongly connected with long-range connections due to the pervasiveness of the airline network. So here is a representation of the world where we have each dot here is an airport, and the lines here are flights between airports. And the flights here is only a subset. The airports is pretty much all of them. And if you look closely here, you will see that in this map, the borders of the continent are not there, are not drawn. But still, you can clearly see the continents and identified continents and countries, because we have airports all over the place. And we have flight between all of those airports. So in the end, we have individuals moving all over the place, and consequently enabling pathogens to move pretty much freely all over the world, okay? If we were still limited to roads, then we would expect to see the usual wavefront of propagation, but since we are in this scenario, this should break down. So how can we incorporate that in our model? So one way to do that is to make use of what we call metapopulation models or metapopulation networks, in which we have a network, so we have nodes and we have edges, but the nodes here are populations on themselves. So a municipality, for instance, or an airport basin, or a state, or wherever we choose as our space definition, okay? And then we have our epidemic model that is run on each of those subpopulations, and the individuals within each of those populations, now they are able to interact with individuals of different municipalities, different subpopulations, with a certain rate or a certain probability that is given by the mobility data that we managed to get, okay? So we now have a force of infection that can also still incorporate structure, social demographic structure, but also we have here an index that refers to what is the subpopulation, and then we have interactions between different subpopulations, okay? And then, of course, if we have a good model and we have good data, we can then start making, building up scenarios to analyze and study what is the expected path of a given pathogen, given that it emerged in a given region of the world. What is the chain of importation that I expect to observe? We can analyze that. Okay, so here's a toy model where we did just that. We used each node here is just aggregated data. So the model is at the level of airport basins, and the nodes here is the aggregation of the model outcome in terms of the WHO surveillance regions for influenza. And this is the jumps between importation events. Okay, so from which region was responsible for the first case on every other region, okay? So we see here, for instance, we simulated starting at Southeast Asia, and we see that to reach southern South America, it's not very common to observe direct invasion from Southeast Asia, but rather from Europe or chain events between Oceania and North America, okay? And this, in fact, is exactly what we just have seen in the case of the coronavirus. Once it was limited to China, we had a lot of suspect cases here, but not a single confirmed case. Now that we are seeing an actual invasion in Italy, we started to observe cases here in Brazil. This is expected. Why? Because of the mobility pattern, okay? How many passengers we have between Chinese airports and Brazilian airports, and European airports and Brazilian airports, the number of people that are making those trips, okay? So, and we can then change our mindset in terms of distance, and we can now talk about effective distance between different regions of the world. So we can move away from actual geographic distance, because we see that for a pathogen, since we have long-range mobility patterns of individuals, to use a geographical distance to try to estimate what will be the next invaded place actually doesn't make much sense, depending on the scale that we are analyzing our data. But then we can change our representation of the world, that instead of using geographical location, we build a network where we put in the center what is the region where the pathogen that we are analyzing have emerged, and we place the other regions on a radial representation in which the distance is proportional to the probability of one individual moving from that place to any other region on the world. And then what we have is that if we run a simulation on top of that, you see here different time lapses. So the red dots here is places that have been invaded, and we see that if we look at the geographical, classic geographical distance, we see as time goes by, cases popping up pretty much at random, basically, if we don't have information on the pattern. But once we change the representation from the classic geographical to this network distance, we recover the wavefront, okay? And why? Because of the mobility pattern that we have. So this work here it was been proposed by this way of analyzing data has been proposed by Brockman and Helbing in this paper in Science 2013. It have already been advanced, and we can use that to then estimate invasion probabilities, okay? And also with those models, we have seen application of those type of methods to analyze and try to estimate peak of infection in different countries, given that it started on a different place. So this is an analysis using the real data set of 2009 H1N1 pandemic, and you see that the model outcome have a good, a relatively good accuracy with the data sets, okay? Another example of application of those methodologies, here is the case of the Ebola 2014 outbreak in West Africa, where we combine a model for the propagation, the evolution of the disease in the countries where we observed the outbreak, and from this mobility model, we estimated then what was the probability of observing a case importation in different countries at in two weeks time windows, okay? And we were also we had some pretty good estimates from there. And of course, then we can analyze what is the outcome of interventions. And one nice thing that came out of that work was that we managed to observe that there was a great debate, as we have now. Well, should we completely block the airline network in the event of an epidemic or not? What we've seen in the case of this outbreak is that if we implemented flight restriction from those three countries, what we have in the end is only a delay of 2 to 3 weeks in the probability of case importation to different countries. So, okay, on one hand, you gain time to act, but on the other hand, you are completely disrupting the economic of that place. And this also have a public health impact, not only on that particular population, but as we have seen in the case of this year with coronavirus, we are observing a breakdown of the global economic structure. In fact, here in Brazil, we have already industries that have closed down they gave vacation leave for their workers because they are not receiving materials from their Chinese counterparts. Okay, so it's pretty much stopped. Okay, also affects the distribution of medication, the access of experts in those areas, and so on and so forth. We can also look back and try to assess for historical diseases what was the likely origin of a given invasion process. So this is an example of a study where we analyze the introduction or the invasion of dengue virus in the state of Acre. So we combine mobility data inside Brazil with historical dengue cases per month. And what we see is that, of course, it doesn't matter that the Amazon region have a very strong connection with Acre, because since there are pretty much no dengue cases in Amazon, the contribution to dengue importation to Acre is pretty low. It doesn't matter that there are a lot of people moving between those places. Since there is no dengue case, there is no importation. On the other hand, Rio de Janeiro state have a relatively low flux of individuals to Acre state, but since it have a very large number of dengue cases historically, the contribution of Rio de Janeiro is pretty important, because what the ingredient is the combination of those two parameters, those two characteristics, right? Mobility and number of cases. Okay, so before moving into surveillance, I hope it became clear that how how far the community have managed to move in the direction of having disease propagation models that are more and more representative of the actual population structure, okay, so that they are hopefully more accurate. But the thing is, the data. How easily it is to access the data. What happens if, for instance, during the census that is supposed to be rolled out, we have a government that thinks that the census is too expensive to be implemented? Of course it is expensive, but it's also extremely important. If we don't have that, and we have just samples, our ability to build those models goes down dramatically. And therefore, our ability to build representative models also goes down dramatically. This is a public health issue, okay? The same thing goes for airline data, okay? So currently, what we have in terms of Brazilian data for flight network, the civil agency for the airlines, what they demand that must be made available is the number of passengers on direct flights between airports, and the number of passengers that boarded at airport A and disembarked at airport B to take another connection. But you don't know, once they landed at B to make a connection, to which other airport was that connection? We have no idea. And did it in fact start his trip or her trip at A? We don't know. The data doesn't specify that. And why? Because it's not mandatory to specify that. And so the data that we have that is publicly available to analyze the airline network within Brazil, extremely limited. And we have to propose methods that with that data set, try to come up with good estimates of what is the actual flow of individuals, okay? Now, surveillance. Quick question, key questions in terms of surveillance. So not only we want to know how many cases we should expect. This is on the realm of propagation models. Here, what we want to know, one of the questions that we want to know is, well, when the season will start. So in the case of endemic diseases, so flu season, dengue season, wherever, so diseases that are already endemic in a given region, we know that usually it starts for influenza-like illnesses in Brazil, usually it starts in winter. Okay, but when exactly? How many cases do we should observe in order to be quite confident that, well, from this point on, I expect to observe a steady increase? How do I manage to separate what is stochastic noise to actual steady increase in the number of cases? This is what we call the epidemic or pre-epidemic threshold, okay? And there's no golden rule to that. So there are several ways, or proposed ways, to try to come up with those thresholds, okay? Each one of them have different assumptions, and what we need to do is basically do sensitivity analysis on top of that to see to each territory, to each disease, what is the more sensible one that we should use, okay? Another important question in terms of surveillance is, well, is the number of cases that I am observing at this time, this current week, how does that differ from what I expect to observe for that same week, given the historical pattern? Is the number of cases that I'm observing right now higher than expected, lower than expected, or compatible? How do we analyze that? So challenges also is, again, data sets, okay? So what we have in terms of data usually is syndromic data. And what do I mean by syndromic data? Is that it's data that is collected at healthcare units based on symptoms of the individuals, not necessarily lab results. So we don't know exactly what is the pathogen that is behind that particular data set that we're looking. We know the symptoms. But then we have several different pathogens that share common symptoms. And that data set, then, it's a collection, a combination of all those cases, the cases of each of those pathogens, okay? And then, if we go back to propagation models, one of the assumptions there is that you are modeling the curve for a specific pathogen. But the data that we have is not for a specific pathogen, okay? So how do we combine those two? How do we tackle that? And then another extremely important point is the issue of time delays in the availability of those data sets. Okay, so we have different timestamps on the data. So the date of symptoms onset, so when the person started to feel those symptoms. The notification date, which is when that person went to a healthcare facility to seek medical attention, and then it was notified in the system. Not necessarily on the same day as symptom onset. In fact, usually not the same. It's at least 1 or 2 days, depending on the disease and the severity of those symptoms. Okay? And then there's another beast, which is the digitalization of those notifications. Because it's one thing to have a healthcare unit that is built upon on top of a fully digitalized information center. So each healthcare facility have a computer that is connected to the internet so that every notification is directly entered into the central database. This is usually not what happens. The notification is first filled out on paper, and then all those notified cases are collected, and then it's finally uploaded to the central database. So this is another date, which is different from symptom onset, different from notification. Okay? And what we see in the data is what has been digitalized. So if the difference between the digitalization date and symptom onset is of the order, let's say, of 1 month, what does that mean is that what I'm seeing in the data today is actually just a fraction of the cases that actually have occurred today. Because those cases will only enter the database 1 month ahead. How do I cope with that? This is different from forecast. This is what we call a nowcasting problem, or a backfill problem, that I'm trying to estimate, trying to guess what is the current situation, not the future situation. Okay? And then finally, another key aspect in terms of surveillance is system report, situation report availability, but not only availability, but actually readability. So if it doesn't matter, if I manage to have a system that is fully automated, reports are shared right away, if the information that is shared in those reports are hard to interpret, this report is meaningless, even though it's timely. Okay? So we have to get down with people from the field, with public health authorities and agents to come up with, this is the infrastructure, this is the analytical methods that I managed to put on top of the data, what is the best way to report my findings so that you can act on top of those findings. This is readability of a situation report. Okay, now we've talked about heterogeneity, importance of heterogeneity, of having spatial resolution, but then for the particular case of respiratory illness, we see that we don't need to have our surveillance units or healthcare units that are placed in the system of surveillance. They don't need to cover all the territory. Okay, so here I take an example from the Paraná state, which is a state that is the beauty of the respiratory diseases surveillance in Brazil. They have surveillance healthcare units in 23 different cities, municipalities in the Paraná state. And here what we have is the correlation between what is the frequency of positive cases of different pathogens within that data set when we compare to subsets of those data, of that same subset of data set, but just keeping only, instead of 23 surveillance units, only 6 healthcare units, but displaced in key areas of the Paraná state. And what we see is that we have pretty much the same picture. This is a lot cheaper. This means a lot less lab tests, a lot less notification cases. So the number of paper sheets that must be digitalized is a lot lower. Okay, so the system is able to work faster. Now, to define those activity thresholds, and I have to move on very quickly now, one way to address that question is by means of the moving epidemic method, which is currently being used for the European CDC, and what we have decided to adopt here for the Brazilian surveillance of influenza is that we, by looking into historical seasons, we analyze the data and identify what is the number of cases, either cases or incidents, it doesn't matter, that usually is a good trigger to identify when we have a steady increase. To give a pretty rough idea, what we do is basically we first do a first approximation to divide each season, so each year of our data between what is pre-epidemic level, so low number of cases, a period with high number of cases, and post-epidemic method. And so we gather these data here from all of those previous seasons, and then we look, for instance, at what is the 95 percentile of that distribution. This is a good approximation for the epidemic threshold. Why? Because it's close to the highest observed number of cases during the baseline, what we first approximated as the baseline level, okay? So what we did is that, so we build an infrastructure for each state in Brazil. So we identify the pre-epidemic threshold, high activity threshold, and very high activity threshold for each state. The shaded, color-shaded area here is related to those, what we call the endemic channels, which is basically what I have talked earlier, which is what is the number of cases that I expect to observe at each week. So the green area is below a very low activity for that particular week, given the historical data. The yellow is between low and the median. The orange area is between median, so expected number of cases, to high number of cases, and then the red is very high number of cases, or that means higher than expected for each given week, okay? So then, by looking into those endemic channels for different regions, what we have is what is the expected week of epidemic activity at each region. So look here, for instance, in the north region of Brazil, when we do have outbreaks, it's not always that we observe outbreaks in that area for respiratory diseases. When we do observe, it's usually in the beginning of the year. While for the states here in the south, it's right during the winter, the typical scenario. So no, it's not always during the winter. It depends on the region, okay? And this we are able to assess by means of those endemic channels. And then in the case of the reporting delay, we proposed a statistical model to try to fill those missing cases, the cases that have not been uploaded yet, because they will only be digitalized weeks ahead. It's basically a Bayesian model that takes into account what is the profile, the delay profile at each region, okay? And using that, so we have in orange here the estimate number of cases at the current week. The green line here and blue line on those two time series is the final counts, so what actually happened. And the dotted line is what was digitalized with only 1 week delay. So we see that we have extremely good accuracy, and especially if we compare to what was available at the time. So this gives us the ability to trigger alerts on a timely fashion. Okay, we don't have to wait 1 month for the cases to be uploaded in order to have a situation. Okay, so this is just a confusion matrix comparing alert levels with the estimated data compared to the updated data. So we have a good agreement, and this is with the raw data, so only 1 week delay, and it's horrible, of course. And then what we can do, just hurry on here. We analyze with historical data, we simulated what would be the expected outcome of interventions if we acted once a given alert level was triggered. Okay, so what we simulated here using 2018 data is, well, if we trigger mitigation events at this week or at this week, and our mitigation is so that we lower the infectivity rate at the level of 1 up to 5%, what we see is that the estimate number of averted cases, SARI cases, so severe acute respiratory infections, it can be from almost 600 cases up to 3,000 is in the most optimistic scenario. This relates to averted deaths, of course. So because if we have less cases, consequently we have lower death rate, and this then finally can be also translated into reduction in the economic burden of that disease. So we can save from the order of $300,000 up to almost $2 million in this small example here. Okay, this scenario analysis, and so all those informations is made available to the public at this website, the InfoGripe website. So we have there panels with a map of the country, with each state colored by the alert level, the time series, and other informations. This is the InfoDengue website, which is the older brother of the InfoGripe, but which uses different data sets, different heuristics for the alert levels. And we all currently have of the order of 600 municipalities in the InfoDengue. For the case of InfoGripe, we have the whole country. Okay, so this will move pretty quick. So here is a snapshot of the InfoDengue website, situation report that is generated automatically. And just to wrap it up, here is a small sample of the main collaborators on those projects. Okay, so with that, in my talk, and I hope that I managed to give you a general idea of what is the current situation and what is the differences between modeling epidemic evolution and tackling surveillance activities. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Do you guys work with universities in providing questions that you would like the academic community to help with, surveillance efforts and activities?
So yes and no, basically. So we have a set of collaborators from universities. So for instance, the InfoDengue, when it was starting, it started as a collaboration with the University of Paraná State, the University of Minas Gerais, because there was a team there that was working with Twitter data for monitoring dengue-related tweets. So, and this is one of the data streams that is incorporated into the InfoDengue project. But at the moment, we are pretty much trying to work on our own. And whenever either we feel there is a lack in our ability to move forward in a given specific road or direction, we try to reach out to different groups that are working on that particular road. And also, at different points in time, we have observed interactions on the other side. So people from the university reaching out to us, trying to collaborate, and we, of course, we are extremely open to that. Okay, so this is more or less the picture, the current picture. Okay, and one thing that it's really nice, it facilitates a lot being working at FIOCRUZ, is that since FIOCRUZ is in a sense part of the, in a sense no, it is part of the Ministry of Health, we have more or less easier access to data sources. Okay, so detailed notifications sheets, and also we have easier access to people that are actually working in the field, so public health workers. And this has been paramount to development of the, as I was saying, the readability of both InfoDengue and InfoGripe website. When we were elaborating, discussing which should be the panels that we have on those websites, this was a back-and-forth interaction with public health workers. Okay?
I think for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Knowing all this connectivity in Brazil and especially having this background from SARS and influenza, it's not possible to predict something about what is going to happen now with coronavirus. Are you planning to do this? Is coming up something?
This is scenes from the next chapter. So on the round table for coronavirus later today, I will go over a little bit on that, but essentially, yes. Of course, there are still key ingredients of the disease that are still not clear at this point, and which affects the evolution of the disease. So our models are dependent on that, and since we don't have a very clear picture as of now, because it's in terms of estimating parameters, it's more or less still in the beginning of the game. But yeah, we can at least start and have rough estimates of what is the risk at different urban areas in Brazil for case importation, for instance, and if we can also, work on scenarios that, well, suppose that São Paulo, for instance, which is the main port of entry when we look into international flow of individuals into Brazil, if São Paulo is invaded, what we expect to be the next places to be invaded, given that it starts to spread out from São Paulo. The limitation on our side at the moment that since we don't have the international flow into Brazil, we cannot estimate the importation from different countries, but we can model assuming that the disease propagates from São Paulo, leaving aside importation from different countries. So just cases generated from São Paulo, where should we expect to observe new cases in different urban areas? That we can do that, at least a rough estimate.
For the network distance approach, where you see that beautiful wavefront emanating from the source of the disease, I can see how that would work very beautifully for something like influenza, where the receptivity in the areas are fairly similar.
Yep.
Not exactly the same, but fairly similar. But for something like Ebola, where it spreads extremely easily in some settings and with great difficulty in other settings, How can you incorporate those features of different diseases and the receptivity of the setting?
This is a very good question. So in the sense of the Ebola exercise, the way that we managed to deal with that is actually running simulation of the disease evolution. So since we have the actual disease model for the propagation, we have all those compartments, the different infectivity in each compartment, and also one thing that we managed to trigger is that, well, for instance, in the African countries, the contribution from disease bodies was very high. But in other areas of the world, it was pretty much zero, because we don't have the culture of interacting with the body of the disease, which is particular to that area. So what we did is that the model, when the parameter associated to the infectivity due to disease bodies in different countries was lowered down to zero. This is one way to cope with that. Another issue is when we have vector-borne disease, because then we need the vector in the location. Otherwise, it doesn't matter that an infected individual goes there. If you don't have the vector, it doesn't care, right? It will not invade. So this, you're absolutely correct. It works pretty well especially for respiratory diseases. This is like the golden boy or golden example for that particular approach. But you can manage to incorporate that. Okay, there are ways.
I'm just wondering if you have like some kind of metric to measure receptivity. You could lengthen or shorten the network distance by that metric and recover that wavefront for these other diseases.
Yeah, out of the top of my mind, I don't know exactly, out of the blue, how to exactly calibrate that parameter, but it's something that we could, again, borrowing from the disease model, try to come up with a good estimate for that parameter to put it down. And of course, in terms of vector-borne disease, there are pretty good models that takes into account, for instance, satellite imagery to estimate, to assess what is the vector abundance in different places. And then this is right away the parameter that we will put into the effective distance.
So, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
A short break of 10 minutes.
A gente rompeu a barreira rompeu a barreira do limiar pré-epidêmico.